Okay, so good evening, everybody. My name is Rocío Castro Viñuelas, and I'm part of the communication team of the Association of Spanish Scientists in Belgium, CEBE. I would like to welcome you all to the webinar that we have organized for today, which is entitled Responsible Research and Innovation for Researchers, Why, What, and How. So before starting, I would like to say just a few words about our association. So we are the Association of Spanish Scientists in Belgium, which is a non-profit organization created, of course, by Spanish scientists that are working in Belgium. And this association was created in 2017. So in CEBE, we work mainly towards three main tasks. We host and organize events on science communication to promote the social impact of science and technology. We also organize events of scientific diplomacy in which we try to create a bridge between Spain and Belgium. And finally, we also work on professional development and networking to try to help scientists to integrate here in Belgium and contributing to their professional development. So CEBE is a small association that belongs to RAICEX, which is a bigger network of associations of Spanish researchers and scientists abroad. So RAICEX represents 18 associations with more than 4,000 Spanish researchers and scientists that are working around the world. So for the sake of the time, I'm not gonna extend more here, but I would like to introduce our outstanding speakers for today's webinar. So we have the pleasure of having René von Schomberg. Sorry for my mispronunciation. I'm sure I did it not in the good way. And Rosina Malagrida. So René is a philosopher and STD scholar. He graduated as an agricultural scientist and has been in the European Commission since 1998 till last year, so till 2021. He's now a senior research fellow at the Kate Hamburger College in the University of Aachen in Germany. And he's also a guest professor in the Technical University of Darmstadt. He has written and edited 15 books, such as one of the most comprehensive books on responsible innovation to date. And he also runs a blog where a lot of free downloadable documents on responsible innovation, socioeconomic aspects of emerging technologies, ethics, and open science are available. Rosina, on the other hand, she's head of the Living Lab for Health at Iris Caixa, and she aims to contribute to transform the RRI health system to make it more open and inclusive, following a responsible research and innovation, open science and system approach. She has previously worked at the Barcelona Science Park and at the Science Museums of Barcelona and London, where she demonstrated her aim to decrease the gap between research and society. And she also has participated as PI in European funded projects related with the RRI during the last 13 years. So thank you very much both for being here with us today. René, if you want to start first and share your presentation, the floor is yours. And before I forget, you can post your questions if you want in the chat for the Q&A, and we will have time at the end of the two talks for discussing with the speakers the questions that you can have.
Okay, great, Rocío. Thanks for your introduction. So I will share the screen. We just tested it, so it should be okay now. So my talk will, I saw just the title, it's about the why, what and how from responsible research and innovation. So my talk will be more on the why. I will give a little bit of an outlook on the prospects of RRI. Now, I will run to, let's say, very shortly, of course, to I think 6 elements why we actually need responsible research and innovation. As the main thing is actually that you can see responsible research and innovation as a normative response to the current deficits of the global research and innovation system currently in place. And the first and most clear element of it is actually that we have no governance mechanisms in place for the outcomes of science, technology, and innovation. We have, especially in the European Union, a lot of governance bodies which govern the risk of a risk of new technologies, for example, risk of products, but we don't have really governance bodies which gives a direction to innovation. And this is an element which I want to introduce as a core element of RRI. Now, what is also lacking is, I believe, or what the major challenge effect is that our current markets, they fail on delivering social desirable innovations. And I think we have gone through a period of COVID, and COVID may be a disaster, but we always make progress in the light of disasters, unfortunately. And in this case, COVID has helped us to advance the notion of RRI, in fact, because we have reorganized science in the light of COVID-19, make it more open and responsive to social desirable demands. But that doesn't go automatically. It's clearly a market failure which we face here. I will not say so much on that issue, but I will, on each of these points, shortly give the argument why we need a form of better governance of research and innovation. Now, what a responsible research and innovation also is about, as I said, we want to give direction to innovation, and that means that innovation has to become value-driven. Value-driven based on values which are broadly shared by the European public. Finally, or not finally, but one other important element is that and that's an element which is typical for research and innovation policies in the past, which were very often or most of the time focused on the technological potentials. Most of the time we try to get the maximum out of particular technologies, but we don't focus on the social desirable objectives. And we will see that in the recent research and innovation policy of the European Union, there has been a shift away from that. And that's a shift more towards RRI. Now, what is also a core element, I think, which is a necessary condition for RRI, and that is that we have to move to open scholarship. Open scholarship means, in fact, that we will make science better by an improved form of reproducibility, efficiency, and also more responsiveness to societal challenges. Finally, I think RRI is all about creating a form of anticipatory governance in policy making, and there we need a combination of various instruments, from foresight to technology assessment to normative, participatory, value-sensitive design. Now, these are the six deficits. I will touch upon each of them very shortly, and some I will go into more in detail. Okay, let me start then with the case for open science. We can say that the nature of scientific discourse, the nature of scientific discourse has changed actually over the last century. What you see here in this picture is a nice picture of the Solvay Society, which convened in the Metropole Hotel in Brussels in the beginning of the last century. And you see as the only woman Marie Curie there, but also Einstein and Max Planck and all these other guys. And they exchanged, and they actually worked in different fields of physics, but they joined together to practice science as an argumentative discourse. Now, unfortunately, I would say science has moved to other forms of its organization, has become more closed, has become very competitive, and this maybe a good illustration is Fanta's competition of the of the publicly funded human genome research in the last decade of the last century, which of course is economy driven, and this made science more close, and this has led to two types of crisis in science, I believe. One is a pertaining crisis in science, which has to do with the reproducibility of data. We can see that 70% of the data of articles published in Nature cannot be produced by colleagues of the same field. So this is very serious. Another very famous lead article of The Economist showed with the title "Science is Wrong" that actually 90% of second stage clinical trials fail. So obviously this is all due to a too close form of science, because if you come too late with your science in clinical trials and then they have to be tested, then of course if the chance of failure is very high. There's another crisis associated with this, and I call this the productivity crisis in science, and that we apparently have to invest ever more money into science to get something reasonable out of it. And this is illustrated by some numbers for the US case, that every 9 years, actually since the 1950s, the amount of money we have to put into science, you know, it has to be doubled in order to get something reasonable out of it. And if you look very reasonably, and this is one of my arguments about market failure, for example, the last 20 years, we haven't produced any new antibiotic, although it's very necessary. It's one of the great challenges in the health system. We don't do it because there is no economic rationale for it. So this has also to do with how we fund and organize science. So this is my first argument, as what I say, we have to move to open scholarship as a necessary but yet still insufficient condition for responsible research and innovation. In the current system, we have actually we actually set up scientists to compete with each other. It's all about gaining prestige, and we do that in the form of publishing as fast and as much as possible. Excellence is used as a self-referential criterion in science. Nobody actually knows what it means. Nobody has a definition of it, but it means that science decide for science what is excellence. I mean, just to make the argument very shortly, we incentivize scientists to produce a lot of papers, and it's underpinned by quantitative forms of metrics. But in the end, of course, by doing this, by chasing scientists to produce more, we make actually the system as such more unproductive. This is the paradox of the production system actually we currently suffer from. Now, to COVID, and of course I made not long before, but we have to move to another form of science in order to be successful when it comes to delivering on social desirable ends. So if we want to have a vaccine, then we have to reward collaboration and sharing information among scientists. We have done this, practiced this with COVID by massively supporting this type of exercise at the cost, of course, that researchers cannot publish original results. But this is what we have to do. This means also that the way we have to reward scientists has to be much more in the direction of what their relative contribution to a research mission is. So in other words, we have to move away from trying to evaluate researchers on their outputs, but more on their behavior. Do they share data? Do they collaborate? Do they work in transdisciplinary context? Yes or no? Now, this means that open science actually, it's not about what very often associated with open access, but open science actually relates to opening up all elements of the science process. So from scientific discovery, where you can use open notebooks, towards open review and research assessments, And very essential is actually the start of the research process with open research agendas, where you can not only have input of researchers, but also from other knowledge actors. So open science, in fact, is opening up not just to opening up your knowledge sources and your knowledge outputs, but also opening up to other knowledge actors to collaborate with them to get more to get a more responsive science system. So I will this a little bit for time. Let me then go to the second argument, and that's the case for a more collective co-responsibility for the outcomes of science and technology. Okay, I can. Oops, goes. Yes, this is a famous example I have here already. I use this many times actually. Maybe for some this is boring, but what you see here is what was dubbed a machine which could sail through the air, and it was developed by a monk, Bartolomeu, in the beginning of the 18th century and presented to the King John of Portugal. It was a combination of different technologies, and he believed that this in Passarola, which is called in Portuguese which is ugly bird for the translation from the Portuguese. And he demonstrated it also with hot air balloons that this might work. And what is interesting to see is here that already by then technologies and innovations were dubbed in terms of risk and benefits. We still do it now, and this is one of the problems we actually face in the governance of research and innovation. Now here the benefits were that much more regions could be discovered for the nation's benefit. You see this, the benefit is special on the benefits for the states. Now the risks were defined as that many crimes could be committed and that people could flee too easily from one country to another. It's actually interesting to see this risk in the current context of the European Union. Now, the recommendation to the king was, it's a very interesting new technology, we will have to use it, but it has to be limited. And this is very typical for the first paradigm of innovation. The first paradigm of innovation I would call the responsible state, in which the governor, in this case the king, is responsible for the outcomes of the technology. And also this is why it is limited of its use. You see that in fact the scope of responsibility is both in terms of risk and outcomes, and also in terms, especially in terms of benefits for the state, as we now still see it in military technologies. In non-proliferation arguments, it's still about who has access and who can control this technology and who is actually responsible. Now, I will not go further into it, there's more to say to it, but the second paradigm, which I call responsible market, is actually the dominant innovation paradigm in which we are in. And there you see that we actually have limited our responsibility in comparison with the previous one solely to the risk of technologies. We don't look to what comes out of it because this is produced by the market. We assume that any innovation is actually good, and that innovation in fact is also not manageable in terms of to give it a particular direction. But we consider innovation as such good because it delivers a macroeconomic advances to everybody. And this has led to certain research and innovation technologies which were always key tech oriented, be it bio, nano, or now AI, in the hope that it will produce economic benefits and that we are faster than competing trade blocks. Now, each of these paradigms have specific forms of irresponsible outcomes and ethical constraints. As time doesn't give me the allowance to go into it, I just want to contrast these two paradigms with responsible innovation. Now, responsible innovation has to reconcile again, not just responsibility for a risk, but also for the outcomes. In other words, we want to have governance bodies which also gives innovation a particular direction. It's not just saying we want innovation because it's inherently good. No, we want to have particular innovations, like we now have with the Green Deal in the European Union. We want to set certain targets. We want to make a transition to a fossil-free society, fossil-free energy system, and that means that we have to give innovation a particular direction, and that means that we cannot leave it also only to the market. It means that public intervention is necessary and put the certain also the legal context in place. So social desirability becomes in fact the major criterion on which we want to give direction to the innovation. What is also what that means, in fact, is that also the way we look in terms of ethics to innovation becomes different, because in market condition, we only have looked to innovation in terms of things which we don't allow. For example, we don't trade organs, for example. This is outlawed, but that means that our ethics is actually a constraint to the market, but we don't say what we do want. So this is my argument that ethics now has to become not just an ethics of evaluation, but also an ethics of construction. We need to have we have to institutionalize an ethics which drives innovation towards social desirable ends, and that means a reorganization in the way of public governance, both of science and the economy. Okay, so there I can now be very short. So in other words, responsible innovation constitutes a new paradigm for innovation in which also social systems institutionalize collective co-responsibility for giving innovation a direction, and also possible shape its characteristics. So that means that we will have to address the market failures, which, for example, we did with COVID, and we can only do that by stakeholder commitment and other means, public-private partnerships, and so on. Okay, let me then shortly highlight the fourth element of actually what is historically a deficit in the research and innovation system, and that we have presented science and technology as a goal in itself. And in fact, in the European Union, in our treaty, science is presented and technology is presented as a goal in itself. It's not further connected to other values. Now science is moving much more into the direction of engineering in all kinds of things. It is actually interesting that the element of responsibility comes much more into the scientist's place. I show you a famous example of Robert Moses bridges. They were built in the 1930s in America, New York, and the bridges are so low that buses cannot pass. And that means that the American blacks could not go to this beach because they were using public transport, and it was a way to actually to prevent them to go there. So you can say these are racist bridges. So you can see that in the construction of technologies or in a bridge, certain values are projected. The same in a positive way, you see here the Staatsberry in the Netherlands, which was actually made as a consensus among stakeholders of fisheries, tourist industry, and safety issues. And that's a dike which has barriers which you can open, and that is necessary to keep the water at the right side sweet, so that it will not affect the fisheries, and at the same time you can protect the shores. So again, there are a lot of values in the science. Now, interesting enough, in our treaty, we have the promotion of scientific and technological advance as an objective in itself, and disconnected from the other values, as you see here, for example, sustainable development or quality of life. Although these values are connected with all other policies. So science and technology policies has always been a sort of exception in this context. So with RRI, actually, we connect the values again to which are already in the treaty, also to science and technology policy. And this is why I speak about value-driven innovation. Now, let me then shortly go to the last point and then later to reconcile. I'm just looking to the time. I think I'm hitting almost 20 minutes, so I don't want Rockio to get mad with me. And I don't want to shorten Rosina's follow-up. So we need actually a follow-up in terms of anticipatory governance, and that means that we can actually shape technology by providing a public discussion on and with foresight on an issue. And just to give you one example, in the future we might have farms which are completely unmanned. We will have automated tractors. We have drones which can predict weather within 2 hours. There will be data collected from the soil by the tractors to know how much pesticides we have to use. And you can think of these technologies in two ways. And the first, the way is that innovation is driven by global markets, and that means if you do that, then you will get a situation where the big companies own all the data, and most likely this will lead to an agriculture producing more commodities like soy and tea and this type of stuff, which you can sell on the global market, and to at least diversity. You can also think of designing this whole new technologies, which is called precision technologies, in a way in which farmers own the data and where farmers cooperate together in order to produce their goods, and they can sell their things online to bypass the retail sector. And you will have another type of agriculture in that case. So in other words, the governance issue, and especially in this case, how you govern the data issue and data ownership, will determine for the long term what type of agriculture you actually get. In order to do this, foresight and technology assessment is obviously very necessary and a component of RRI. Now, just to sum it up, it's so RRI is about organizing and institutionalizing collective co-responsibility. We have to go to open research and scholarship, changing the way we fund the research and do research. We have to make value-driven innovation a sort of constitutional matter, and the public, and we need to have go to another public governance of the economy by giving some direction to innovation. This means, among others, the institutionalization of foresight and TA in public policy, facilitating of alternative futures discussions, public debate. And maybe to end with my talk with is a new feature in the European Framework Program, and this is our missions. And they have actually essentially all the RRI elements in it. They are based on co-design and co-creation by stakeholders. They are driven towards a social desirable objective, not just a technological objective. And it means that also the inclusion of citizens in research agendas when done well. I hope that these missions will be done well because they are very complex and big. And but all the demands of RRI actually are in there. And I hope these missions will become a success and will be a step up to a further inclusion of RRI in research. And as I said, the key thing is here that the research and innovation becomes value-driven and centered around the Sustainable Development Goals. I will finish here that, but I cannot do it without advertising our book on the International Handbook on Responsible Research and Innovation. But much more easier for you is just to go to my website and you can download some things for free. This is my website, and there's also other stuff you might find interesting. I hope this was instructive, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share this with you. And I would say hasta luego, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, René, for the great presentation and for sharing those resources with all of us. We have some questions, but as I said before, we will keep them for the ending of the webinar. So now I think, Rosina, if you want to share your screen or your slides, we can listen to you and then we can do the discussion at the end of the webinar. Thank you, René, again.
Thank you, René, and thank you, Rocío. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the responsibility to talk after René von Schomberg, who is the boss in responsible research and innovation. So I'm going to share my screen now, and I'm going to start my presentation. As you asked me, I will talk about why, how, when, and what to focus our research and especially our research becoming responsible research and innovation, and our innovation as well. And the aim, of course, is to increase the impact of our research, or as René, von Schomberg says, to allow a proper embedding of scientific and technological advances in our society. And as he says in his definition, we are talking today about a process. And we are talking about making it more transparent, more interactive, and making sure that all the stakeholders we involve become mutually responsive to each other, and all with a view to the ethical acceptability, sustainability, and societal desirability of the innovation process and the products as well. So it's talking about the process and about the products. Sometimes there is small space to reflect on the process, but we reflect more on products. So here the importance is on both processes and products. And he has talked a lot about the concept itself. So I'm going to try to move towards more practical examples of how we see it from our living lab that we have created within an institute of research, which is called Irsi-Caixa, which is located in a hospital in Barcelona. And basically what we see with this definition is that he is suggesting us to change the way we solve our problems. And why is he saying that? Actually, he has already answered that question, so I'm going to move fast through this slide. But basically, there are 3 reasons and not one. And I say 3 and not one because normally we tend to think that we will do so because, for example, if we are in the health domain, we may see that the need to involve patients for a normative reason because they have the right to participate. But actually, there are 2 more reasons to do it. The second one is instrumental. As he says in the definition, we need a proper embedding of science in society. We need to find no obstacles to implement the results of our research and to make it move through the value chain. But last but not least, we need also substantive reasons, which are that we need to improve the results. And as René has already mentioned, we are in a sort of crisis in science in some aspects. And for example, the amount of waste research, as the Lancet called it some years ago, needs to be reduced. We have some complex problems that have become persistent because they are complex, and we are not finding effective enough solutions, or we have unmet needs that we are not addressing, or values that are not aligned sometimes with the technologies or the results and the products we launch to the market. So how can we make sure that we address all these goals? Well, before the existence of the definition of René, we would say that we were talking about a model of relationship between the research and innovation system, which, as you can see here, I have illustrated researchers and industry, and we have been talking for a long time about the need to improve the relationship between research and industry. But we can see here that there are stakeholders that have traditionally been left outside, and those are civil society organizations, policymakers, and the education community. And before his definition of RRI, we were struggling to make sure that we, inside the system, we were communicating properly with those that were left outside. And we were doing so with science communication, but also with units of technology transfer. So whenever we finished a product or a service or whatever, we wanted to make sure that the market would accept it, and we would explain it and sell it with different channels in order to make it useful and embedded in society. But we know now, and even before the definition of RRI, that this is a deficit model, and what responsible research and innovation tells us, which is easy to display in a slide, but not in reality sometimes, is that we need to share responsibility, as René was saying, and not only with citizens, but also with the stakeholders, right? With different stakeholders, in order to make sure that these technologies will penetrate the market, society. And in his definition, he talks about being responsive to each other. And this means that we will need to take care when we organize events with the different stakeholders on the level of participation. There is a ladder of participation where the lower level is just informing our audience, which is what we used to do before the definition of RRI. And we see now that just informing is not being responsive. In order to be responsive to each other, at least we need to consultate and then be open to change our process according to what we receive from this consultation, or we can even go up the ladder and establish partnerships or delegate power, even at some times in our projects. And when do we want to reflect on the level of participation that we want to achieve in our projects? Well, if you think about your project now, for example, you may know the research cycle, right? So in a project, you normally identify the challenge, then you prioritize the research question that you want to address, then you define the research process and the management of it, then you undertake the research, you disseminate the results, you implement the results. Luckily, maybe sometimes you need to go back until you are able to implement the results, and then you do some evaluation of the impact of what you did, and you start again this cycle. So basically what we normally do if we are conducting responsible research and innovation is to think about how you are going to make it more open and more inclusive in these different phases of the research cycle. And here I will leave this slide for you. I won't go into detail today because there's no much time, but we developed it in a course that we gave in EIT Health, where we already described some examples of things that you can do by interacting with different stakeholders in each of the phases of this research cycle. And we are actually applying this, for example, by creating community advisory boards. For example, in our research center, we have created a community advisory board, which is very useful for that. So whenever we have a project, we bring it to this table with different stakeholders from public authorities and also patient associations, and we get feedback from them on our protocols, our information sheets, our informed consents, communication campaigns, and so on. And the feedback they give us is very valuable in order to improve our protocols and also the other items in the list. But you can also set up, for example, industry advisory boards or interdisciplinary advisory boards for your research line or your research challenge. Then we realized that by doing that, we were having very important feedback, but still we needed something else. And we thought that we needed to pay more attention to the what, because actually what we were bringing to this community advisory board were the projects once they were already defined. So we thought that we should open the reflection as well before to decide the research agendas. And we found, for example, this very interesting paper by Jacqueline Broers, which describes a model which is called the dialogue model, with different steps that you can follow in order to bring different stakeholders to co-decide a research agenda. We have been doing that for different challenges, like the promotion of sexual health, COVID-19 prevention, where we had more than 800 stakeholders participating, the promotion of mental health, or now, more recently, we are starting to work on long COVID as well. And what we get from these experiences are a list of projects that we need to implement, and which normally are unmet needs that are not still being implemented in our area. And therefore, we make efforts to find somebody to implement those. And then we go back to the research cycle and explore with them how to make sure that these projects are implemented with an open and inclusive approach in each of the phases of the research cycle. And with that, we do actually have some impact. However, what we face is that, of course, these projects are defined with a view to acceptability and desirability, as the definition says. But what about sustainability? What we face is that if we launch the processes as I explained before, we face barriers for implementation. So the barriers for implementation are actually in different areas of the system. What do I mean by that? I mean that if we conduct participatory process, for example, on the challenges of health I mentioned, where we engage patients, healthcare providers and researchers, we still face that when we have already a product and we want this product to become mainstream, to have the impact that we would like, we realize that to cross this area here, and here I'm representing with this image, which is called the multi-level perspective in technological transitions, it represents an example, for example, of research and innovation breakthrough that we would like to have a lot of impact. Like, for example, it could be an app to change habits towards healthy and sustainable diets. What do we see? That this challenge is a socio-scientific challenge, and therefore the elements that they have put here in this drawing are elements of all the systems. So we have elements of knowledge, of social issues, of infrastructures, of economic aspects, policy aspects, and so on. If your challenge, maybe my audience today, you, the audience, are not working on socio-technical issues, but perhaps you are still trying to address a complex issue in the scientific domain, then perhaps the elements you might see here are different disciplines and different lines of research, which are near the line of research that you are trying to address. And what we see here is, for you to have the impact that you want to have, these elements here need to change at the same time as you are crossing, as you are trying to launch your product. And this means that if you don't work with this element collectively, sharing responsibility, as René was saying, you are not going to manage to get the impact you would like. I'm trying to explain this. I will try to explain the same now with different slides to see if it becomes more clear. Let's put an example. Let's go back to the example of this app that could be used to change behavior towards habits of sustainable and healthy diets. So we have a challenge, and then I have a very good idea. I want to focus on behavioral change with this app. So I designed a research process, and I launch it with open research or responsible research. And then I will do responsible innovation, and I will have a very good app that I would like it to scale up and really have a lot of people using the app and changing diets. And to do that, what I will do is involve in the research and in the innovation stakeholders from the system, meaning end users, but also, of course, experts in developing apps, experts in behavioral change, experts in nutrition, and so on and so on. And I expect that this will be the best app in the world. But what I face then is that this app actually is not having the impact I would like. Obesity is rarely being, the prevalence of obesity is rarely being addressed with the impact that we would like in all the countries in the world. And the reason for that is because actually we are having a wall here. It is a wall with different elements of the system, which are those elements that you saw in the multi-level perspective before, right? And actually what we are seeing is that sometimes we are trying to solve a problem by seeing only a part of the iceberg. And one-off interventions will not be enough. We need this shared responsibility that René was saying in order to address the problems when they are complex. And then we go back to the how. I already had a how before, which you saw how we were addressing it in our research center. But then if we realize that we have this complexity, how should we implement responsible research and innovation? Well, we think we need to make sure that we move from a linear thinking towards a system thinking. So seeing our problem not only as being complicated, passing from problem to solution, but also as being complex. And this means that we need this shared responsibility that René was saying in order to take into account this wall and therefore change different elements of the system for that role that you saw before to really have the impact you would like in society. And how do you address complexity? Well, you need a lot of stakeholders because, of course, having all the perspectives of the iceberg cannot be done with one single discipline or one single sector. You will need a lot of stakeholders from a lot of organizations addressing different areas of the system. And here you have examples of areas of the system, different phases of the value chain of whatever you are trying to develop, different geographical levels, organizational levels, sectors, solutions, challenges, academic disciplines, research and innovation line, and also, of course, different processes for change, right? So looking at how change is happening, where is it being facilitated, what are the facilitators for this change, and so on and so on. So basically what we are seeing, and this is something we developed within this European project called Fit for Food, is that we need to develop three sorts of system knowledge. The first one is the system knowledge on the present, where we need to see all these green balls and the dynamics, the interrelations between them. So we need to map and understand why is it so difficult to solve what we are doing. Then we need also target knowledge. So to imagine this foresight that René was saying, to imagine how a future would look like when these problems here have been overcome. And finally, we need to develop transformation knowledge to understand these elements in the system that will need to change in order to make sure that our innovation will reach the impact that we would like. And once we do that and we know which activities or which projects we need to run, of course, we will run the projects with collective experiments, with loads of different projects being run collectively, and then we will monitor what we achieve and start the cycle again. So assess, develop all the knowledge I said, and develop the strategies for change, and then implement and reflect again. And this is a wheel, so we need to go through the cycle again and again every 2-3 years, depending on the project. So basically, we are talking about collective strategies, and we are talking about making sure that because our problems sometimes are complex, we need complex solutions, which are this combination of different missions, different projects acting collectively towards a shared mission, shared objectives with system thinking and system innovation, and very importantly, with what we call transdisciplinary research. Transdisciplinary research, as you may know, is this research that doesn't only integrate knowledge from different disciplines, but it also integrates knowledge from different disciplines with non-academic environment. And non-academic environment, again, are not only citizens at large, but are also those stakeholders that are these elements in that slide of the multi-level perspective that will allow us to achieve the goals that we want to achieve. Therefore, what we are talking about is a change, as I said at the beginning of my talk, in the way we address our problems through transformative networks, or what are called as well transition innovation arenas. And what we see in these arenas or in these networks is that we will end up having projects. You can see here, this could be projects, and this could be responsible research projects, meaning that there are different stakeholders working together in each of these consortiums, but how these consortiums will eventually reflect together, and how those at the same time will eventually also reflect together. So we can see different levels of reflection, different levels of learning in order to develop the three sorts of knowledge I mentioned before and manage to collectively address the mission that we want to address. So as a conclusion, we need to better respond to persistent and complex societal challenges like the Sustainable Development Goals, but not only. I guess that in this room today, there are people working in different research lines that also need to address complexity better sometimes and to take better into account the different solutions and the different definitions of problems at local and global level, and seeing whether the complexity is within the scientific and technical and technological domain, or both in it and also at social level. Therefore, I started my talk talking about the fact that we were talking about the relationship between science and society, or science and different stakeholders that were traditionally left outside. And actually, we are talking about the relationship within the scientific community and with different stakeholders. And we are talking, of course, about changing a new way of problem solving, where we already have a lot of projects that are excellent research. We have very good researchers already, but our challenge now is how to make sure that in a connected society in the 21st century, we work in a more interconnected manner to achieve a more effective emerging system to better solve these persistent problems by not only focusing on, for example, describing a process in a cell, for example, but at the same time also understanding the process of the system, of the actions, the instruments, the actors, the stakeholders, the organizations, the conditions that are facilitating us to develop the knowledge that we need in order to have the impact that we would like. And with all that, we can achieve this movement, getting out of the deficit model and moving towards this model that René describes as the collective responsibility, with a more collaborative, decentralized, and systemic model of governance. And this can be done through this transition innovation arenas. Thank you very much. I would like to leave you with this slide with two links to two websites that can facilitate you some methodologies and examples and resources that can be interesting for you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosina. It has been a very nice presentation and also very clear. I think now we all have a much better idea on RRI and especially the how and the things that we can do. I think we have some time for questions. We have actually a lot of questions, so I think we can start with the discussion. Some of them are very interesting. I see, so this question for René, but I think it can be also for Rosina because you also talk about it. So it's from Ana Barragan, and she says, you have mentioned several times that societal desirability is what should guide responsible innovation. However, what about basic research, which does not really translate into societal benefits in the short term? How does responsible research applies on that?
Okay, I'm unmuted, I think, yes. No, thanks for that question. This is, of course, you know, you have, it's true that if you look to the history of how we finance research, you always have a sort of three parts. One is for the traditional curiosity-driven research, and then there is a bunch for applied research, and then we have research which is done with third parties, for example, and with industry or other organizations. And through history, I think the only thing what we did is changing the balance in the funds. And more recently, I think the pendulum, our clock, let's say, has swung a little bit more to what you call basic research, or you know what is called in European Union frontier research, funded by the European Research Council. Now, I would not say, though, that especially if you talk about frontier research, that this is completely decoupled from social desirability. I mean, if you look, I mean, because the issue of you know, what type of knowledge you want to produce, and what type of you know, what type of topics you want to address is, of course, within a certain framework. It may not be to a particular target. It may not be to, let's say, applied research mission, but I would not say that it's decoupled fully from social desirability. I think it's legitimate, though, and maybe is this the underlying issue of your question, whether, you know, I would not say that all research has to be research missions in a term which are now featured in the framework program, let's say, modeled around these 6. I don't say we have to do only research like that. So I still would also argue that we need other research swings, but at the same time, I would not say that the value-driven element is decoupled from the others.
Okay, indeed. And I think this can lead a bit to another question that it's in the chat. It's saying it looks like for RRI taking place, both governments, researchers, and society have to be very well coordinated. So do you think it is currently easy for the different parts involved to work together on this, on how these things should be improved?
I think one way to improve it, of course, is relates to the reorganization of how we fund science. So, in the sense, so my basic argument is that we have to reward collaboration and cooperation more than we traditionally do, and this is why I use also the COVID example, because there you see for certain missions you have to cooperate in order to have success. And so, well, this was an emergency case, so we do it. But I think for all societal challenges, we need this cooperation, because especially in very complex topics, be it climate change, for example, you need enormous cooperation in terms of data sharing and so on. You cannot have success without doing it actually in an open way. So and that means we have to reward collaboration, and that means that we have to change the incentive structure for research. But again, I don't want to mislead you by now saying that we only have to fund, that all researchers now suddenly have to collaborate in all kinds of things. I mean, it's obvious that there are other legitimate research missions. But I want just to highlight the argument that currently we actually don't incentivize this collaboration enough, and this is why the emphasis is now there.
Actually, there's another question that now is posted by Lisa Haverlin. It's about that actually. So, what in your view could be incentives and or rewards to encourage responsible open science practices?
Yeah, so this is indeed, so actually, this is why it's actually now so convenient that COVID is there. So you have seen, for example, I mean, when I still was in the commission, my colleagues had set up this together with a couple of institutions, a COVID-19 platform in which data on the genetic constitutions of the viruses and so on was shared. And within a year, they had more than 4 million researchers sharing their data there. So you can see that it wasn't a means to, open data was a means and to share your data instantly, more or less. It was a necessity to address things very fast. I mean, if we would not have done it in a normal course, to develop a vaccine would at least take 10 years. So, but unfortunately, it's not only about COVID. If we want to solve the sanitary problems in third world countries, we equally have to do this. So, and we don't do it. We don't apply it to those areas. And I think it's an argument about what we do when we what do we do with the public funding of research? When you talk about industrial funding of research, okay, it follows another logic. But what do we do? What does the public wants to get out of the research? And there we have to say, okay, social desirability is a criterion. And of course, then the question comes up, which very often comes up in these questions: what is social desirable? I think we globally have convened also on the slides which Rosina shared on sustainable development goals. That seem to be common challenges, equally shared by Chinese or Indians or Europeans or Americans. They all find this. I find this important.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then there's another question, maybe it's regarding what Rosina was saying on how to evaluate how we are doing with that. It's from, okay, there's no name, but they are asking, are there any tools for performing some kind of retrospective analysis on how we are doing in terms of responsible innovation?
Yeah, we were involved some years ago in a platform which is called Responsible Research and Innovation Tools, RRI Tools.eu, which was one of the websites I showed in my last slide. And there is a self-reflection tool, which will help you to reflect on some aspects of RRI, how you are achieving them and how can you improve on them. That can be useful. And after that, there have been more projects. And in this website, you will find loads of links to resources in the same line.
That's right. Okay, thank you, Rosina. Another question, it's about, I think this is very interesting, is about open science. Maybe this generates a bit of debate. This is asking, I was wondering about the open access to science, which was also mentioned. Regarding the open access papers in journals, you end up paying a few thousands euros to publish open, so money that it's normally coming from the university, from European grants or others, but the editorials lobby and system would remain equally strong. I know it is an eternal debate, but what are your thoughts about the open access publications?
I guess this is for me, no, Rocchio. So
it has not specific anything. Yes.
Yes, please, René, go ahead.
Okay, all right. No, I think that, yeah, this is a good question. In fact, this is also why I have a very double feeling with open access. In fact, it depends really on how you practice open access. If open access means indeed that we only have this so-called gold open access, where the authors or the institutions where authors work pay for publications, then you get actually a system. You could imagine, I mean, I can imagine quite a lot of negative things, I would say. You could imagine that researchers would then like to work in institutions who provide sufficient funds to publish your papers. If they don't do it, then it becomes de-incentivized. Or it means also that if you are not a researcher based at a university, but you want to publish things, that you actually blocked for publishing. So this open access in that form can certainly have negative impacts. And my own thinking about this is that I think we focus too much on the publishers. I mean, the universities who complain that this is all very costly can make it much less costly by telling their own researchers, why you not publish on our own website of the university or on our own depositories. For example, the rector of the University of Liège in Belgium, I think more than 10 years ago already, said, okay, if you want to get promotion in our university, you have to publish in our open research repository. And researchers did that, and then apparently also the inclination to publish in top journals became much less. So the problem was more or less within the context of that university resolved. But generally, universities like and researchers like to publish in top journals, and I think this is part of our incentive system, which actually makes research very unproductive. It can lead research to the wrong issues, and it can make it very costly. We pay the publishers for that, but it's not only it. We should not complain only about the publishers. It's our institutions who apparently like to have their researchers publish this stuff in there, and I don't see the necessity of it. And I'm glad that more and more open research and information structures are being established, where researchers can publish their papers for free and can share their data for free, and also which also leads to much more citations, by the way, and also much more readings. So it's a win-win situation. But the question is good. I do think the current open access policies have some can have some negative consequences, and we have to we should have a look to that.
Indeed. There's another question from the attendants. Might it be a problem if several countries or regions in the world use RRI and others don't? Think, for example, about allowing certain kinds of research in Asia, but not in the European Union. Will that hinder progress or even collaborations on a global level?
I think that has already happened with some lines of research, right, René? Like, for example, with stem cells. The legislation to conduct research with stem cells is different in different countries. So this is not something that will happen, but it is already happened. And of course, yes, this can create differences in different countries. And the ideal situation would be this collective responsibility that René was suggesting, to make sure that we agree and that we advance. But we know that in the world, that's sometimes not easy. And this links to another question here on the interests of certain stakeholders and how these interests sometimes lobby and have more power than other interests. And here there is a very important role of the way the engagement processes are defined. Because if we define them and we put all of them together from the first moment of the process, we may have these strong voices with the strong powers collapsing the discussion. So we need to make sure that we design engagement process that will allow to take into account these differences in driving forces and driving interests, so that we can come to an informed decision-making processes, taking into account the different perspectives.
Thank you, Rosina. I don't know, René, if you want to add something on this, or we can move to another question.
Well, maybe shortly. It is, of course, true that it can also be a consideration concerning open science. And you could imagine that in Europe, we would do more open science than, let's say, in the US. And the fear would be that that researchers would move to the US, for example, if they. But this move would only be, you know, one has to look also to the motivation system. I think researchers have basically maybe two big motivations. One is to advance knowledge, and the other one is to have impact on society. So, and with RRI, you do, of course, the latter. You can also do in Europe still very well the first. I think it's more a matter of how it's incentivized and where you put the money on. I think the researchers in the end are like normal people. They follow the money. If you put money on RRI, they will go there. If you don't put it on RRI and something else, they go something else. It's simple as that. So I argue to have more money for RRI.
I understand. Okay, then there's another question. I think it's also very interesting considering the people attending. This person mentions that all the suggestions that you are mentioning in your presentations should be made more at the level of a PI, principal investigator. But what about the PhD students and the postdocs? How can we implement, or how can we contribute to the RRI ourselves?
Sometimes when I give trainings on RRI, some students, PhD students, say that it is a very interesting approach, but actually the capacity to be responsive to each other doesn't happen sometimes even in research groups. So as they say, so how can they deal with that, right? Of course, in this research, they can think about the research cycle that I showed today and explore how at each of the phases of their research, they could open their research and make it more inclusive, and also reflect on who they should involve and think about this who if they could help in advancing the different phases of the value chain of their research, but also afterwards. So if we know that afterwards this research could be followed up by another research group or another research discipline, make sure you already involve those. If it's going to be at the end used by somebody, make sure you involve those. If you are doing basic research and you know that in your basic research there have been spin-offs created in the past, involve then also at some stage those spin-offs and talk to them, reflect with them, also with disciplines that you feel that there is some possibility for knowledge integration. So there are always opportunities for PhD students to start moving in this direction. And if even you can also run a course in your research group or a talk and disseminate what it is and try to advocate for it in all the group, not trying to push on your own, because sometimes on your own in the group will be difficult, and try to push towards the other members of your group and even the PI if it's possible. Mm-hmm. And also at organizational level, try to move the issue at organizational level.
These are very good examples, I think. I think now we as part of CEBE, we are also contributing to this. We are not PIs, but we are mainly postdocs and PhD students. So we are organizing this webinar. I think we are somehow contributing to RRI, which is something. There's also another question here in the chat. Very interesting about sharing of good quality data. So what do you think about the sharing of good quality data? A lot of times methods are a bit doubtful, incomplete, or incorrect. Are negative results truly negative or wrongly performed?
Yeah, I think this goes actually, this is again a good argument for open science. Again, researchers, of course, don't. I mean, actually, this has changed in a short period of time. I think in the history of how we actually organize science. I think, especially in the last 20 years, there has been researchers don't feel to share their failures anymore. They only want to publish, of course, positive responses and positive data. And then you get into a strange situation. So, I mean, already many years ago, I talked to editor of Nature, Philip Campbell, and he told me that 60% of the articles published in Nature, the data underlying these articles are not reproducible. So, yeah, this sounds very bad. And this is, of course, the consequences of not sharing. And people, of course, researchers learn from negative results. They are sort of necessity to advance. And if you don't share that, you actually make the system also less productive. So again, we need an incentives for doing that. There are actually now, I think, some fora where this is also encouraged. Yes, indeed, you can actually also not make clearly the distinction what is good quality data and negative and bad quality. You need all types of data in order to produce something which is in the end good. So you need all these outputs and make them accessible. So maybe in a further digitalization of science, we could do this actually more easily, where researchers working with open notebooks could already share their data very early on. And this is again a question of incentives. We can even require researchers to use these laptops in the future. Mm-hmm. So I think there's still some work to do there.
Indeed. Okay, so I think we have more or less gone through all the questions, and we are already running out of time. So if there are no more questions, I think we can close the event already. Thank you very much, both Rosina and René, for your splendid collaboration in our webinar. It has been very, very interesting. I hope for the audience it was interesting too. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Roggio, for the facilitation. Good to see you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you from my side as well, and a pleasure to share this webinar with René. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you to you for participating. Bye.